Well, welcome to Parent Sitting. I've been MIA for the last few weeks due to an unexpected, very fast turn of events regarding my dad's health. And I was even debating if perhaps, I should take more time away. But I felt what happened is a perfect example of how parent sitting can turn our lives upside down. In the middle of last month, I had a pre-planned trip to Michigan to visit my parents and do the usual check-in, see them face to face, make sure they were doing as well as they could despite their dementia and respective cancers. And even though I have people seeing them and helping them several days a week, for me, it's still important, that I get to see them as well. So I flew to Michigan on a Wednesday. It was probably around 5 p.m. by the time I arrived at their community. I had been notified by my brother, who was visiting them just a few days earlier, that he thought my dad had lost a lot of weight since we last saw him around Christmas time. I didn't really think too much about it because he's lost weight slowly over the last, year or two. But then I walked in the door and I saw how frail he looked. I also noticed that he was breathing heavily. He seemed to be having an overall difficult time moving around. His head was hung low. Everything about him seemed like he was struggling. He had a hard time getting out of his chair and a few other obvious signs that he was just struggling, having a difficult time at the moment. I asked if he was okay, if he was in any pain. He said he's fine. So I didn't know exactly what to do. So we went down to eat. I noticed that he didn't really eat a whole lot, and so that was something that stood out right away. Um, we talked a little bit, and then we came back upstairs, and I eventually weighed him that night. And this is where I kind of knew, things were not good. I put him on the scale. The scale read 146 pounds, which was about 13, 14 pounds lighter than he was just 8 weeks prior when I was in town. So fast forward to Friday, he already had a scheduled checkup with his primary care physician that morning. But by now, I noticed his balance is off. He had a hard time just walking to the elevator. He couldn't walk more than 10 feet without having to sit down. It was like this complete struggle for him to do anything. And he was making this groaning sound as if he was in pain. And I kept asking him if he was okay. Was he hurting somewhere? And he said no. But I could see his chest literally rapidly pulsating in this frail little body with a sweatshirt over the top. So we go to the doctor, and after about 10 minutes at his doctor's office, the primary care physician, she instructed us to go directly to the emergency room at the hospital down the street. His hands were so cold, she was unable to get a pulse from his fingers. She even tried putting warm towels around his hand to warm him up. That didn't work. He was so weak. We tried to walk out of the doctor's office to get down to the hospital, and he couldn't do it. He walked a few feet, and I almost had to hold him up. Then we tried to walk to the door of the doctor's office. He couldn't get there. I had to sit him in a chair. So now all of a sudden, I'm kind of in this panic because we're sitting at the doctor's office, and she just told us to go to the emergency room. So there was a wheelchair outside. So I had to go get the wheelchair and wheel him out to the car that he had just walked out of 30 minutes before. He was literally unable to walk at this point. His balance was off. He was too tired to stand up. So less than 10 minutes later, we're at the emergency room at Henry Ford West Bloomfield in Michigan, waiting with what seemed like 50 other people on this Friday afternoon. And what's crazy, I realized later that in my whole life, I don't think in my advanced age with the AARP crowd, I don't think I've ever been into an ER room before. So this was like my first experience. Um, and after waiting and waiting, about 2 or 3 hours later, he was finally taken into a private room in the ER. The hallways were lined with people that didn't have rooms yet, and he was immediately hooked up with all the typical hospital machines to be monitored. And all of a sudden, it was as if he was declining right in front of us. What I saw 30 hours earlier was much different than what I was looking at right now. So it was either that night or the next day. An ER doctor came and talked to me, and he happened to be a cardiologist because my dad has a pacemaker, and we're doing some testing and checking that out. Um, and the doctor kind of talked to us and talked to my mom, and my dad was kind of awake, not really awake. Um, so the doctor walked out, and I walked with him, and I kind of told him my parents' situation because obviously he didn't know anything about them. So I asked him kind of, what's going on, what's the deal. I was told outside of the room that my dad was not only experiencing heart failure, but that he had blood clots in his legs, lungs, and heart. Actually, we found out later that day that he had a blood clot in his heart. They saw that, I guess, at a different point. The mass in his liver had also grown in the last month. And I could tell by the doctor's tone that we were now down to the final stretch. And he didn't say a lot, but finally, I asked him point blank, what he thought. And he said his best guess was that maybe my dad had a month. So obviously, when you hear that news, it takes you a little time to process it. But my mom started walking towards us, and we kind of just, kind of changed the tone of the conversation. But the fact that he wasn't eating and would not eat could expedite how much time he had left. So all of a sudden, this 4-day visit is extended. And I will say this, what was weird, I remember that Friday, for some reason, I was pissed. I'm like, I can't believe I'm here on vacation. I'm sitting in the ER room for hours. And I thought, God, what an ass you are. Like you're kind of selfish because I don't know. I don't know if I thought it was that serious, but it was this weird feeling that I felt like maybe because I've been doing this for so long, I was almost just tired of it. And then all of a sudden now I have this realization how serious the situation was and how things changed. And I felt, it's hard to admit that, but I felt terrible for even thinking that I wasted, 5 or 6 hours sitting in a hospital on a Friday night. It's not like I had anything better to do, and obviously nothing more important than this. But anyways, my focus had to shift, and I'm thinking about, okay, what do I say to my mom? What do I tell my dad if he asks? And how do I manage these next steps, right? Of what's to come. Because of my mom's dementia, I told her the bare minimum that his heart was failing and they were trying to treat the clotting. But for now, I was just going to leave it at that with her. So after spending all day Saturday and Sunday at the hospital until the early evenings, there was a point on Sunday afternoon that I just knew my dad was never coming home. You could look at him and it was like this shell of a person. He was moved on Sunday to a regular room in the main hospital. But in a span of 48 hours, he was unrecognizable, barely able to move. He was sleeping almost all day long. He wasn't able to eat. He was having a hard time speaking. He was confused about where he was, what was happening. He did make some comments. What's crazy about this is that he doesn't know where he is, but at some point on one of those nights, he told us this story about being a ball boy at a basketball game that Oscar Robertson played in Kentucky. It was like the Kentucky versus Ohio or Kentucky Indiana All Stars or some game like that. And he could tell you all about the game. And he told me how many points Oscar Robertson scored, but then he just fell asleep. And for some reason, I don't know why this story came about, but he just threw it out there. So those first few nights, I drove my mom back to their community. Every night I walked her to their apartment. I told her how she needed to take care of herself and that we needed her to sleep, eat, and take her own medications. But with each day, even with her dementia, you could see that this was all sinking in, that there was this fear for him, fear for herself, and also I'm sure that frightening feeling when you're 83 years old of being alone in this world without him. So by Monday, it was reiterated to me by another doctor at the hospital and my dad's cardiologist that his passing could come any day. That's how quickly things went downhill. But they all agreed they didn't see this lasting more than a month. For the most part, I had held up pretty well, but I realized I had to say something to my mom because she was expecting that my dad was coming home soon and things would be back to at least their normal, even though I think she could see his deterioration and how serious it was. She never really said anything, at least when we were in the hospital. So I walked into the hospital room and I said that I needed her to come outside and talk with me. And honestly, I wasn't sure what to say or how to say it. And I remember we went into this area that had some couches and chairs. And I remember I couldn't look her in the face because I didn't want her to see. I'm sure my face probably would have told the story. But I started to speak. I couldn't really find the right words. And I think because I was struggling to get anything out, she picked up that I was struggling and she immediately started uncontrollably crying in this area of the hospital before I could even get any of my words out. So she knew how bad things were, and all I could say is that his heart was failing, as we talked about. But you have to remember, you kind of have to mention these things to her over and over again because of her dementia. Because there were times where she kind of forgot what was going on. She just knew that things were bad. So she knew how bad things were. And all I could say is that, we're going to do what we can. And there's really nothing the doctors could do from at this point, and all we can do is be here. I never said that he wasn't going to make it because I don't think in her condition that was going to serve any purpose for her or anyone. I only said that he wasn't going to be able to come home at least for a bit. I think, and I'm still doing it, I wanted her to still have some hope that maybe things could change. So it was February 23rd, and as we were about to leave the hospital that night, I wondered if I should say goodbye to my dad. It's just, I felt like maybe this was a time. And after seeing him the last couple of days, I had this overwhelming feeling that he would not be with us the next morning. And I don't know why it was that night, but each night on 6 straight nights, I drove my mom back to their community, as I mentioned, and we did the same thing every night. I had bought a bunch of pre-made food at this great grocery store called Bush's. We'd heat it up and we'd sit at the table and talk a little bit. And I never wanted to leave until I wanted to make sure that she had time to process things each and every day in her own way, and the events of that day or what have you. But on this Monday night, you could see she was starting to fall apart a little bit. She blurted out that she and my dad met when they were 18 years old as freshmen at Michigan State University. I kind of jumped in because I knew where she was going and where her mind was going. So I reminded her of all the great things that had happened in their lives and our lives as a family. She agreed that we could never have imagined all the amazing experiences and people that we had encountered over all these years. I was kind of trying to do everything I could at this point to kind of keep her spirits up. And for some reason I looked over and I'm like, how can I keep her mind from going in the wrong direction? So I pulled out a notepad and I gave her a pen. I said, think of all the great things that she could think of over the past 61 years of marriage and write them down on a pad of paper. I said, when you look at it, at this list, you'll be reminded of a great life, a life that is something to be proud of and smile about. We talked about all the good fortunes we've shared. She smiled and she said, okay. I stood up, hugged her, and I went back to my hotel. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. I was just overcome with these emotions and feeling that this was going to be the morning that my dad would no longer be with us. I don't know why it was this particular night, but I couldn't believe the decline I was seeing, and I think my mom had the same feeling. So I picked her up that Tuesday morning with my gut filled with anxiety. When I entered the apartment, there was this, I don't know how to describe it, but this overpowering smell of feces in the apartment, for lack of a better word. My mom was sitting on the couch, and I kind of looked around, and I didn't really say anything at first, but something just didn't seem right. So I'm looking, I didn't see anything. So I decided I walked to the bathroom. Apparently, she was feeling the same anxiety that I was. And at some point in the night or that morning, she didn't quite make it to the toilet, and it looks like maybe she had diarrhea. It was clear she attempted to wipe it up in her own way. But with dementia, there is this, as many of you probably know, there's this inability a lot of times to just complete a simple task like this. And, she did her best. And I asked her, I said, did you have an accident? She said yes. I could see the embarrassment and sadness on her face. So I took a second and I kind of smiled at her and I said, "Oh, that's okay. No big deal. Don't worry about it." I put on some rubber gloves. I grabbed some Lysol disinfectant spray and I wiped down the floor, the toilet, some other areas, everything else in there in no time. So as I'm doing this, I'm thinking, and I walked out and she was still sitting on the couch in the same spot, her legs together, kind of hunched over. And you could tell she was almost in tears. And she said she was sorry. And I remember pausing and I kind of looked at her sad face. So I smiled at her. I said, "Hey," I said, "no big deal. Let's go see dad." And we walked out the door holding hands and we walked all the way to the elevator. And I'm sharing this particular story really for only one reason, because there was something that I learned on this trip, and it was really a huge mistake that I've been making over the past few years. In the past, I would have been furious about this bathroom incident and that she just left it and didn't clean it up and take care of it properly. But over time, now I realized I needed to be meeting them where they are, not trying to get them to come where I am. And what I mean by that is, and I think everyone probably does this if you're dealing with people that have dementia or some type of cognitive decline, right? I needed to understand what they could process, and I needed to stay in that lane. I needed to be the calming voice instead of that dictator voice, or the voice that was always trying to make everything better or try to make sense of everything to them, because that wasn't going to work. And I think if I had known that way back in the days when there were mail issues or the bills or things with the house, maybe I could have reacted differently. But here I am, 2, 3 years later, and I'm literally just clicked in my head these past couple of weeks. So I know some people out there are struggling with many decisions about their parents. And while I was there, I thought about how life really does work in funny ways. I lost my job a few months ago after my position was eliminated. And since then, it's allowed me to focus on my parents I still focus on myself, but I do, you know, really my main concern is for them. And I do believe that things happen for a reason, and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing right now. I remember walking the halls of the hospital for the 6 days and nights, and I passed all these different rooms, and there are a lot of elderly people in there. I noticed how many people were alone, and I was able to be there all day, and several people had nobody come see them, or if they did, it was for a short, visit to say hello. And I realized, most people can't leave or take off work because they have obligations they can't just walk away from. So I feel fortunate actually that my mom and I could be there each day for my dad. I had to come home back here to Arizona for a bit. Now I'm going to go back to Michigan in a few days. And every day I wake up, I realize there's a possibility I'm not going to see my dad alive again. And he did survive the 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 past day that I had all that anxiety, and he's still kicking at this moment. But I plan to be there until the end. And my last night at the hospital on this trip, I wondered in my mind, if I should say goodbye to my dad. But we were leaving. My mom was standing there next to me, and I was afraid she would understand what I was doing. So instead, I took a picture with him and I said, I love you, and I'll see you when I get back. I'm not sure yet if I'll regret not saying more at that point. He was asleep almost all day, every day, and wasn't lucid most of the time. But at the moment, my only concern was to make sure that my mom felt there was still a chance because I knew she was going to be coming back the next day and the next day. And as I sit here today, as I mentioned, my dad is still hanging on. He's been moved from the hospital to a 24/7 care and rehab center, but I know his days are numbered. And I think having spent so many days there on my last trip, I've kind of come to terms with it because you have all these days to process it, and you sit there and you look at someone who's essentially just shriveled up in a matter of a week. And, the one thing I never want is, or none of us would want, is to see him get to the point where he's suffering. My mom still sits there 7 to 8 hours a day cheering him on. And I told her, I make her go home at night and eat and take a break. But she told me, I just always want him to know I'm here. And for me, that's what their story is all about. So that is it for this episode. I will be back when this part of the journey is over. And as always, remember to love them, hug them, and show them the grace they once gave us.